The tape sat in a cardboard box marked Rejected Masters 1971 in the back corner of a climate-controlled archive room at Columbia Records. For 30 years, nobody had touched it. Nobody had listened. It was just another failed session from a year when the label had recorded hundreds of them. Until Michael Richardson, a junior archivist hired to digitize the vault's contents, pulled the box down in 2001 and saw a handwritten label that made his breath catch. Armstrong / Fitzgerald, Dream a Little Dream, June 15, 1971. Do not release. He'd been working in archives long enough to know that do not release usually meant something interesting. A take that went wrong. A performance the artist hated. Sometimes, rarely, something so personal it wasn't meant for public consumption. He threaded the tape onto the machine, put on his headphones, and pressed play. What he heard over the next 4 minutes made him cry at his desk, made him understand immediately why this tape had been buried for 3 decades, and made him realize he was listening to one of the most heartbreaking, beautiful, historically significant recordings ever made. This is the story of that tape, of how it came to exist, of the night 2 dying legends defied their doctors to make music together one final time. And of what happened when someone finally listened to what they'd created in that studio 30 years earlier. Louis Armstrong was dying. Everyone knew it. The man who'd defined jazz trumpet, who'd made gravelly vocals cool, who'd brought joy to millions with that inimitable smile and impossible technique. He was 70 years old and his heart was giving out. The heart attack had come in March 1971. Massive. Devastating. They'd rushed him to Beth Israel Hospital in Manhattan, stabilized him, but the damage was severe. His heart muscle was compromised. Blood flow was reduced. The doctors gave him strict instructions: complete bed rest, no exertion, certainly no trumpet playing. Mr. Armstrong, doctor. Alexander Schiff said with the gravity of someone delivering a death sentence, if you play trumpet again, the strain on your cardiovascular system could trigger another heart attack. And the next one will kill you. I'm not being dramatic, I'm being medical. Louis nodded from his hospital bed, but something in his eyes said he wasn't really listening. Or rather, he heard the words but was calculating whether the risk was worth it. He'd been in and out of hospitals for years. The constant touring had destroyed his body, but every time he'd bounced back, gotten back on stage, made people smile. That's what Louis Armstrong did. He made joy happen even when his own body was falling apart. But this felt different, this felt final, and lying in that hospital bed, unable to play, unable to perform, Louis started thinking about what he'd leave behind. Not just the recordings, he had hundreds of those, but the things left undone, the collaborations he'd always meant to pursue, the music he'd imagined but never made. One thought kept returning: Ella Fitzgerald, his friend, his colleague, the other voice that defined an era. They'd recorded together before, of course, the Porgy and Bess album, the Ella and Louis series, beautiful collaborations that showcased both their talents. But there was one song they'd talked about recording for years and never got around to: Dream a Little Dream of Me. Simple, sweet, a love song that wasn't really about romance but about comfort, about companionship, about the solace of knowing someone understood you. Louis wanted to record it with Ella one more time, one final collaboration before his heart gave out for good. He mentioned it to his wife, Lucille, who visited every day. I want to do one more session with Ella, just one song. Lucille looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Louis, the doctors said. I know what they said, but Lucille, I'm dying anyway. 6 months, maybe a year if I'm lucky. I'm not spending that time lying in a hospital bed staring at the ceiling. I want to make music one more time with Ella. They'll never allow it. Then I won't ask permission. Doctor, Schiff found out about the plan 3 days before Louis intended to execute it. A nurse had overheard Louis on the phone with Norman Granz, Ella's manager, making arrangements. The doctor confronted Louis immediately. This is suicide, doctor, Schiff said bluntly. The exertion of playing trumpet, of singing, of the stress of a recording session, your heart cannot handle it. You will die, maybe not immediately, but soon, very soon. Doc, Louis said, smiling that famous smile that could charm anyone. I've been dying for years. We're all dying. The question is what we do with the time we've got, and I'm not spending my last months as a prisoner of medical caution. Mr. Armstrong, I cannot in good conscience approve this. Good thing I'm not asking for approval. On June 14, 1971, Louis Armstrong checked himself out of Beth Israel Hospital against medical advice. The paperwork required him to acknowledge that he was leaving despite being informed of the severe risks, that he understood another cardiac event was likely, that the hospital would not be responsible for the consequences. He signed everything without hesitation. Lucille stood beside him, terrified but understanding. If Louis was determined to do this, she'd rather be there supporting him than fighting a battle she'd lose anyway. Norman Granz had arranged studio time at Columbia Records' 30th Street studio. Same place Louis had recorded countless sessions over the years. Familiar, comfortable, as safe as any environment could be for what he was about to attempt. Ella arrived early. Granz had explained the situation. Louis was sick, really sick. This might be his last session. She'd agreed immediately, rearranged her schedule, shown up ready to make whatever Louis needed to make. She was 54 years old, dealing with her own health issues. The diabetes that would eventually steal her eyesight was already causing problems. Her legs hurt, her energy wasn't what it used to be. But for Louis, she'd show up, always. The studio was set up simply. 2 microphones, a small combo for accompaniment, piano, bass, drums, nothing elaborate, just enough support to carry the song. When Louis walked in, Ella's heart broke a little. He looked so small, so frail. The man who'd once filled entire concert halls with his presence was shuffling carefully, moving like someone afraid their body might betray them at any moment. They hugged carefully, aware of each other's fragility. "Thank you for doing this," Louis said. "Thank you for asking me," Ella replied. "What are we?" "Recording, Dream a Little Dream, just like we always talked about." Ella smiled. "Perfect." Phil Ramone, the engineer, watched from the control booth with a mixture of excitement and dread. He was about to record 2 legends, but he was also watching 2 people who looked like they might not survive the session. If something went wrong, if Louis collapsed, if Ella's health failed, he'd be the one who'd facilitated it. "You sure about this?" he asked through the talkback. "Never been more sure," Louis said. They ran through the arrangement once. Louis didn't play trumpet, even he wasn't reckless enough to risk that. Just vocals, him and Ella trading lines, harmonizing, making something beautiful with just their voices. But even singing was hard. Louis's breath support was shot. His cardiovascular system couldn't provide the air pressure needed for sustained phrases. He'd take a line, have to pause, catch his breath, continue. It was labored, difficult, nothing like the effortless Armstrong of 20 years ago. Ella adjusted instinctively, took longer phrases to give Louis more breathing room, supported harmonies where his voice wavered, made it a collaboration where they covered each other's weaknesses. After the first run-through, Louis had to sit down, breathing heavily, sweating despite the air conditioning. Lucille, who'd insisted on being in the studio, brought him water and looked at Ella with gratitude for being so patient. "You good to keep going?" Ella asked gently. "Give me 5 minutes," Louis said. "Then let's make the real take." Those 5 minutes felt eternal. Louis sitting in a chair, eyes closed, gathering whatever strength remained in his failing body. Ella standing nearby, not hovering but present. 2 old friends who'd spent decades making music together, now facing the possibility that this was the last time. Finally, Louis stood up, walked back to the microphone, nodded to Phil Ramone. "Let's make something beautiful," he said. The accompaniment started, simple piano chords, soft brushes on drums, a bass line that supported without intruding, and then Louis began to sing. His voice was rougher than it used to be. The gravel had become rocks. The smooth power had been replaced by fragile determination. But the emotion, God, the emotion was overwhelming. Every word carried the weight of 70 years of life. Every phrase sounded like goodbye. Ella came in on the second verse, her voice still powerful despite her health issues. Wrapped around Louis's fragility like a blanket, she didn't try to match his energy or his tone. She complemented it, made space for his weakness, and filled that space with strength. They sang to each other, not to an audience. There wasn't one. Not for commercial success. This was too raw for radio. They sang because they were friends who'd survived the music industry together and wanted to say something true before one of them disappeared. Stars shining bright above you. Louis's voice cracked slightly on above, not from technical failure but from the physical effort of sustaining the note with a dying heart. Ella picked up the next line seamlessly, giving him a moment to recover. The bridge was where it almost fell apart. Louis attempted a phrase that required more breath than his compromised cardiovascular system could provide. He started strong but ran out of air halfway through, had to cut off, catch his breath audibly on the recording. In any other session they'd have stopped, done another take, fixed the mistake, but Ella kept singing, and after that gasping breath, Louis came back in, joined her on the final line, and somehow it worked. The imperfection made it human, real, a document of two fragile people making beauty despite their bodies betraying them. The final verse was a duet. Their voices intertwining, supporting each other, covering weaknesses with combined strength. Louis's gravel and Ella's silk creating something neither could have achieved alone. The last note hung in the air, then silence. In the control booth, Phil Ramone sat motionless. He just recorded something extraordinary, not technically perfect, far from it. But emotionally devastating, historically significant, a document of two legends at their most vulnerable, making art despite everything. Louis sat down immediately after the take finished. Breathing hard, face pale, Lucille rushed to him with concern. "I'm okay," he said, though clearly he wasn't. "Did we get it?" "You got it," Phil said through the talkback. His voice was thick with emotion. I don't even have words, that was beautiful." Ella sat down beside Louis, took his hand. They sat there together for a long moment, two old friends who just created something they both knew might be Louis's final recording. "Thank you," Louis said quietly. "Thank you," Ella replied. They listened to the playback once. Ella cried during parts of it. Louis smiled, that famous smile, even though you could hear death in every note he'd sung. It wasn't a happy song. It was a goodbye. "Perfect," Louis said when it finished. "Don't change a thing." "You sure?" Phil asked. "We could punch in that spot where you ran out of breath. Clean it up." "No," Louis said firmly. "Leave it. That's the truth of it. That's what it means to make music when your body's giving out. Don't polish that away." Louis Armstrong died 6 weeks later on July 6, 1971. Heart failure, just like Schiff had predicted. The recording session hadn't killed him immediately, but the strain had certainly accelerated the decline. The obituaries poured in, tributes from presidents and musicians and millions of fans who'd grown up with his music. He was celebrated as one of the greatest artists of the century. His recordings would live forever, but the dream. A little dream session with Ella wasn't among them. Columbia Records executives had listened to the tape, recognized its emotional power, but also recognized its commercial liabilities. Louis's voice was clearly compromised. The breathing issues were audible. It wasn't the polished Armstrong that radio stations wanted, and releasing it felt exploitative, like taking advantage of a dying man's final session for profit. The decision was made to vault it. Protect Louis's legacy by not releasing something that showed him at his weakest, even if that weakness was also deeply moving. So the tape went into the archive, marked "Do Not Release," and was forgotten. 30 years passed. Louis Armstrong became a historical figure rather than a living artist. A whole generation grew up knowing his music only through recordings made decades before his death. Ella Fitzgerald passed away in 1996, taking with her the memory of that session. Everyone who'd been in the studio that day eventually died or forgot. The tape sat in its box, untouched, unheard, until Michael Richardson pulled it down in 2001 and pressed play. He listened to the entire 4-minute recording 3 times, crying harder each time. Then he went to find his supervisor, a senior archivist named Patricia Knowles who'd worked at Columbia for 40 years. "You need to hear this," he said. Patricia listened. Her expression changed about 30 seconds in. By the end, she was crying too. "How is this not released?" Michael asked. "How did nobody know this existed?" Patricia explained the decision that had been made in 1971, the desire to protect Louis's legacy. The fear that releasing such a vulnerable recording would diminish his reputation. "But that's insane," Michael said. "This is beautiful. This is important. People need to hear this." "It says do not release," Patricia pointed out, pretty clearly. "That was 30 years ago. The people who made that decision are gone. Louis is gone. Ella is gone. Don't we have a responsibility to history now?" Patricia thought about it for a long time. Finally she said, "Let me make some calls." The debate over whether to release the recording was intense. The Louis Armstrong estate was protective of his legacy. Some family members felt that releasing a recording that showed him so weak would be disrespectful. Others, including musicians who'd known Louis, argued the opposite, that hiding this recording was denying the truth of who Louis was at the end, still making music, still creating beauty, still refusing to let physical limitations silence him. Ella's estate was more straightforward. If it shows Ella being there for a friend when he needed her, release it. That's who she was. After months of discussion, the decision was made to include the recording in a comprehensive Louis Armstrong box set being prepared for his centennial in 2001. not as a featured track but in a section labeled Final Sessions, with extensive liner notes explaining the context. When the box set was released, music critics and fans had mixed reactions. Some felt the recording was too raw, too painful, too intimate for public consumption. Others called it one of the most moving documents of friendship and artistic dedication they'd ever heard. Wynton Marsalis, trumpet player and keeper of jazz traditions, wrote about it. This is what courage sounds like. Not perfection, not polished technique, just two people who loved music more than they loved their own comfort, making art despite everything. That's the lesson, that's the legacy. The recording found a particular audience among hospice workers and people caring for dying loved ones. Something about hearing Louis struggle for breath but keep singing resonated with anyone who'd watched someone fight to hold on to the things that made them human even as their body failed. A hospice nurse wrote to Columbia Records, "I play this for my patients sometimes when they're afraid that illness has taken away their dignity. I tell them about Louis Armstrong, who couldn't breathe right but sang anyway, who made something beautiful in his last days. It helps them remember that value isn't about physical capability, it's about spirit." Phil Ramone, the engineer who'd recorded the session, was still alive when the tape was finally released. He was interviewed about that day in 1971. "I thought maybe I was participating in something unethical," he admitted. Letting a sick man exert himself like that, but Louis knew what he was doing. He chose to make music, chose to spend his remaining strength on creating rather than preserving, and Ella supported him in that, not enabling self-destruction, supporting self-expression. "Do you regret recording it?" the interviewer asked. "Are you kidding? It's one of the most important things I ever captured. That's what music is, humans connecting despite limitations." Louis and Ella showed what it means to keep creating when everything says you should stop. The Dream, a Little Dream recording never became a hit, never got significant radio play, but it endured in a different way, as a document of friendship, of artistry triumphing over physical decline, of two legends saying goodbye in the language they spoke best. Music students study it now, not for technique, the technique is compromised throughout, but for emotion, for the lesson that music isn't about perfection but about truth. Listening to Louis struggle for breath and keep singing, listening to Ella support him with every phrase. Listening to two dying people make something beautiful together, it teaches something no polished studio recording ever could. That 30 years in a box wasn't wasted time. It was necessary time, time for perspective, time for the people who'd made commercial decisions based on market concerns to pass on, making room for archivists who understood historical value transcends radio friendliness. Michael Richardson, the archivist who discovered the tape, kept a copy on his phone, would play it sometimes when he felt like giving up on difficult projects, reminding himself that Louis Armstrong literally gave his last breath to music and didn't quit. If he could record while dying, Michael would say, "I can finish digitizing this archive." The recording exists now in the Library of Congress, preserved as a national treasure. Scholars can request to hear it, musicians study it. But most people still don't know it exists, which is fine. It was never meant to be a hit. It was meant to be a farewell, a final collaboration between friends, a document of what it means to create despite everything screaming at you to stop. Louis Armstrong left the hospital against medical advice, recorded one final song with Ella Fitzgerald, died 6 weeks later, just as the doctors predicted. But in those 6 weeks between the recording and his death, he had the satisfaction of knowing he'd made one last piece of music that mattered, with someone who mattered, saying things that needed to be said before he couldn't say them anymore. The tape sat in a box for 30 years, forgotten but not lost, waiting for someone to care enough to listen, to understand what they were hearing wasn't a commercial recording but a human document. Two people saying goodbye in music because words would have been insufficient. That's the real legacy of that session, not the recording itself, beautiful as it is, but the lesson it teaches about choosing how to spend your final days. Louis could have stayed in the hospital, could have preserved his strength, could have lived maybe a little longer in bed. Avoiding exertion, instead he made music, spent his remaining strength creating something beautiful with a friend, left the world one final gift that was imperfect and vulnerable and true. And 30 years later, when someone finally listened, they understood. This wasn't a footnote to Louis Armstrong's career. This was the thesis statement, the final word, the summary of everything music meant to him. He'd rather sing one last time and die than live a little longer without singing. That's what the tape says. That's what those 4 minutes of labored breathing and cracking voice and unwavering determination document for history. Louis Armstrong escaped the hospital to make music, and the music he made, flawed and fragile and forgotten for 3 decades, turned out to be the most honest thing he ever recorded.